try to give you all the most updated information that's come from the department, but it may not be everything and it may not be totally up to date. So if there are those in the room who also know about this guidance, I invite you to chime in and make sure that we're sharing the most up-to-date information. Also, let me add on to the introduction that Nate gave. He sort of told you about the work that I do, which is as an attorney. So I'm seeing all of this through the eyes of parents and students. But I have colleagues on our team who work directly with educators and in schools and with schools during this time. And they kind of are seeing it through the perspective of educators. And what I want to say is I'm going to go over the guidance, which is the recommendations that the Department of Education is sending out to schools and districts. This is the ideal. This is what should be happening. But we also know that there are tremendous pragmatic difficulties to delivering education to students during this time. And so I want to just acknowledge that nobody's saying this is easy to do or that educators don't need more support to do all of this on behalf of our students and families. And I don't want to come across as though this is just so easy to do. It's easy to say, it's difficult to do. In terms of questions, I think that we haven't been able to get the chat function working tonight, which is often a convenient way of doing questions, but we don't have a crowd that's too huge. I think it will be just fine. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, just unmute yourself. I think I gave people as a co-host the power to unmute yourself, and I would invite questions as we go along. Okay, so with that said, let's get started. Here's the information that I'll go over tonight, and I understand that we have an hour together or until 8 o'clock, so we'll try to cover all of this. First, although the focus is on students with disabilities and the IEP process during COVID-19, it's going to be helpful to start with just some basic information about remote, hybrid, and in-person learning generally, and then we will turn to special education. I also want to share some information from a very recent guidance about English learners with disabilities, so those dually identified students and some specific provisions that apply for them. Next, I want to talk about compensatory education, which are those makeup services that students on IEPs may be entitled to because they've missed some education along the way, going back to March when schools first closed. Then I want to end by sharing some real practical resources for families and those supporting families during this time, and some specific actions that as attorneys, my colleagues and I would recommend if things aren't working so well, things that families can do to try to make things go better. And then if there's any time left, and there probably won't be, but if there is, we'll reserve it for questions and discussion. So remote, hybrid, and in-person learning generally. So first and foremost, and again, this is sort of coming from the perspective of parents, what is parents' role in deciding how their students will learn this fall? Well, in its initial fall reopening guidance, the department made clear that it's families in consultation with their medical providers who will ultimately make the decision as to whether their children will attend in-person instruction or continue with remote learning. Now, of course, a lot of what's governing this now and going to be governing it into the foreseeable future is the public health data and whether or not it's safe for schools to open. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But if in-person learning is made available, either in a hybrid model, so for part of the time, or full-time in-person learning, it remains parents' prerogative to say, you know what, that's not going to work for my student. Either because there's a health vulnerability or a pre-existing condition or an elderly relative living in the household and we just can't take that risk. Every parent has the right to choose remote learning. And every district needs to have a remote learning program for those parents or students who choose it. Importantly, and with the clients that I serve, one piece of misinformation that seems to have been communicated quite frequently is the idea that once parents have made the selection of which model, remote, in-person, or hybrid they choose for their student, they can't change their mind. That's not true. Parents are able to change their mind. And in fact, I think what we're all living through right now is even districts are having to change their policies about what they offer because of fluctuating positivity rates in local communities. So if a parent has selected in-person learning, but they want to switch their child to remote for any reason, they can do so. And the reverse is true as well. If the parent has chosen remote learning to begin the school year, but wants to transition their student to in-person learning, if that's available in their town, then they can choose to do so. What the department says is that districts may set a reasonable transition period, no more than 4 to 6 weeks, for that student who had been learning remotely to transition into the classroom. And that's just because with social distancing and other considerations, they gotta have some time to get ready for that student to rejoin and make sure they've got the right student to teacher ratio and that they're maintaining the proper distance in the classroom, etc. So they can have a transition period, but it can't exceed 4 to 6 weeks. All right, so what are the recommendations for in-person learning in communities that have this option? So this is a very recent guidance that has just come out this month in which the department has updated its recommendations about in-person learning. Here's what they say. First, districts are now expected to prioritize in-person learning across all color-coded categories. So this is the governor's and the Department of Public Health's color-coded system for each community that is linked to the rate of positivity in that community. So we've got communities in the red, the green, the gray. Across all color-coded categories, districts are expected to invite students back into the school building unless there is suspected in-school transmission. This is updated guidance, and the reason they've changed this is because of the increasing amount of data which shows that in-school transmission is really, schools are not the most serious place where transmission is happening. The transmission doesn't seem to be happening as frequently in schools as in other public locations. And so there should be an emphasis on getting kids back into the school building. But here's some additional information about this. Districts and schools in communities designated gray, green, or yellow are expected to have students learning fully in person if feasible. A hybrid model should be used only if there is no other way to meet health and safety requirements. This is a change in many communities. Schools in red communities, so these are ones where the positivity rate is higher, should implement hybrid models, meaning some students are attending school in person in the building on some days and then other students on other days, but not everybody at once. They should implement hybrid models while maximizing in-person learning time for high-need students. And I'm going to go over in a second who those high-need students are. Now, in those communities with the highest COVID-19 case loads and test positivity rates, and right now that would be Chelsea, Lawrence, and Revere, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed, along with the Department of Public Health, will work with those districts to come up with and implement customized strategies. And finally, fully remote instructional models should be implemented only as a last resort in classrooms, schools, or districts where there is suspected in-school transmission or a significant municipal outbreak. Now, that doesn't mean that parents couldn't still choose it. Parents continue to have that right to choose it, but fully remote, meaning everybody is on remote instruction, should only be used as a last resort. Okay, so I mentioned the high needs students that should continue to be prioritized for any district that's utilizing a hybrid model. Well, who are those students? Listed on this slide. So the term that the department uses is the students with complex and significant needs. Those would be students with disabilities, meaning students that have an IEP, as well as English learners. particularly those with more intensive needs. And when we talk about special ed, we'll talk about what some of those intensive needs are that students with disabilities might have. It also means students whose parents and caregivers report that they don't have access to reliable internet or even a suitable learning space at home. Students who are significantly behind academically, students who were disengaged or who really struggled during previous remote learning periods, like back in the spring when this all first started, and those early learners, students in grades pre-K through 5. These are the groups of students that should be prioritized for coming back the minute any school building opens. So what else about in-person learning for these kids who are able to come back? Well, the state says schools should plan for a return to school 5 days per week if feasible. Now, I know in my cases, I don't have a single student for whom this is true, and I think probably for good reason. A lot of districts are having 1 day of the week be a non-in-person or non-in-school day so that they can do extra cleaning, so that they can really sanitize the school building and get everything clean. In a number of my cases, Wednesday is serving as that day, especially if there's a hybrid model. You might have some students coming in on Monday and Tuesday, and then everybody's home on Wednesday so that they can clean, and maybe even so that some related services under IEPs can be delivered, that kind of thing. And then a different group of students comes in on Thursday and Friday. Schools are encouraged to utilize alternative spaces, including, although the days where we can do this are dwindling now, holding class outside. And that's just to maximize space and keep people from being in large groups in closed-in spaces, including community spaces, even spaces outside, the actual school property. Haven't heard of many schools doing that, but they are encouraged to think about it. Specialist teachers and other educators may be redeployed. They can be re-enlisted to serve as core teachers in the school building. So maybe the librarian. In fact, in one of my cases, there's a librarian who has become the 2nd grade regular ed teacher because the school needed her so that they could have reduced class sizes. I'm going to talk in special ed about some important caveats for this if students are entitled to get specialized services from special educators, those with special certifications. This does not apply to those situations, but for regular education classrooms, teachers can be redeployed. Inside those classrooms, students should have assigned seating, and this is in part for contact tracing. In the rare instance where there might be a transmission of COVID in the school, really important to know who was a close contact of each student, and assigned seating helps with this. And finally, schools have been encouraged to really reduce the mixing of student groups. So like on the playground, in the cafeteria, especially in elementary schools, you kind of want those students to kind of remain as one cohort throughout the school day and not to have that cohort mixing with other cohorts. What are the recommendations for hybrid learning? So this is where students are going into the school building part of the time, but not every single day. So the department has recommended that schools use an A and B cohort model. Kind of talked about this already. Some are doing it where they split the week in half and one group comes in at the beginning of the week and a different group comes in at the end. Other districts are splitting it week by week, where one group of students comes in for the whole week while the others are learning remotely from home, and then it flip-flops the following week. Again, those high-need students should be prioritized for full-time learning, even if everybody else is on hybrid. And a couple of my clients are in this boat. Their districts are using a hybrid model, but my client, because they have more needs, has the right to go into school every day, even while other groups of students are coming and going. Students without technology should be doing their remote learning in the school or in another community organization. What does that mean? It means that even if they're in a cohort, which is not in the teacher's classroom on that day or in that week, they could still be in the school building, zooming into the teacher's classroom from another spot within the school. Therefore, they're not mixing with the other cohort, but they're able to use the technology that they may not have at home. Now, in one of my cases, even the school doesn't have technology to do this. And so, for example, this is a digression, but even when the teachers have to log on to an IEP meeting, they have to go home to log on to their Zoom because for whatever reason, the Wi-Fi and the technology in the school isn't very good. So that would be a situation that's against the expectation. The expectation is that the technology would be better in school than it is at home, but maybe that's not always the case. Okay, what about remote learning? And the question on this slide says, what are the new features of remote learning? And that's because the department has made clear that remote learning is supposed to look different than it looked in the spring, where it was really much more variable across schools and across districts. We want to see more standardization now. And so what are some of the new features that should be characterizing remote learning this fall? Well, first and foremost, the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education made clear that the structured learning time requirements that are typically in place during an in-person school year are also going to be in place this year. Even though kids are coming and going and we're switching from in-person to hybrid and remote and back and forth at the end of the year, kids should have basically the same amount of structured learning time that they would have had they been attending school in person all year. Now they've deducted a little bit for those first couple of weeks at the beginning of the year where teachers were given extra time to get ready. But basically the same ratio still applies. So for elementary school students, they should have, if you do the division, about 5 hours per day of structured learning time. And for students at the secondary level, they should have about 5.5 hours per day of structured learning time. Now, in the spring, what they were recommending was about half a school day's worth of education, which would be more like about 3 hours. So you can see that once these requirements are put into place, students should be spending more time learning than they were in the spring. Structured learning time is not recess, social or informal check-ins, or non-instructional games, or study periods, or optional school programming like clubs. And I think this is a provision that kind of has a double edge to it. On the one hand, that sounds great because we want kids actually getting their academic learning. But one of the things that we've learned in our practice is that those social times and those unstructured periods, gosh, I mean, that's just kind of like how you keep the relationships going. And so this drive toward more academics and more structured learning time sounds really great. And for some students it is, but in some circumstances it really impedes the ability to kind of form those relationships and keep kids engaged. So I think it has sort of a double edge to it. Second point about remote learning is synchronous and asynchronous learning. Words, I never used before of COVID, and now everybody's talking synchronous and asynchronous. What does that mean? Well, synchronous is live instruction like we're having right now, and asynchronous means that it's recorded or it's independent learning time, but it's not live instruction with an educator. Districts still have the discretion to determine the amount of synchronous and asynchronous teaching and learning during this fall, during remote learning periods. However, there are some baseline minimums that must be in place. So first, there does have to be for every student some amount of regular, consistent opportunities to access live synchronous instruction, which includes, by the way, student-to-student interaction, not just student-to-teacher. And there's got to be collaborative projects and teacher feedback and other needed supports. In addition, there must be regular two-way communication between students, educators, and families, which is something that in almost all of its guidance, the department is really stressing, especially during remote learning. Gosh, that communication is just so critical. In my cases where the communication is happening well, those students are doing much better, even if they're still struggling, but where the parents just can't really get any communication from their school or teacher, that just compounds problems that may already exist. In addition, enrollment. Sort of already talked about this, but parents who don't want their children to attend school in person may choose the remote learning option. Number 4 is an important one, and it goes along with these structured learning time regulations, attendance. Beginning this fall, schools are required to take daily attendance, differentiating between students attending in-person, hybrid, or remote. And I've heard some, horror stories, I guess you could say, of like, you know, first grade classes where every time they log back in for a lesson, the teacher has to take the first 15 minutes and do attendance. Meanwhile, the kids have totally lost any engagement that they had when they first sat down in front of the Zoom. And gosh, I think that's not necessarily working out great in all circumstances, but the hope is that by taking attendance, we can assure students are meeting these structured learning time requirements. The department reminds parents that they are responsible for ensuring their child attends school every day. It's not optional. Kids need to be attending. And finally, schools are instructed to investigate extended absences and encouraged to work with families to identify barriers to attendance. And the reason why I think this is such an important one to linger on for a minute is that we know that in many circumstances, the students who are not attending, it's not because the parents are irresponsible or not asking them to attend, it's because they have learning barriers or barriers to their engagement of all different types. They could be disability related, they could be language access barriers, technology barriers, many reasons why it's hard for students to engage remotely during these times. And we don't want to punish students for legitimate barriers they may be encountering. And that's why this instruction to investigate what's going on if there are extended absences is really important. Finally, on remote learning, grades. Now in the spring, schools and districts were encouraged not to grade student work because we didn't want that added pressure with everything else going on. But this fall, they are instructed to assess all students based on both the district and individual teachers' performance criteria. So students will be graded. Now, this performance is supposed to be, or the criteria are supposed to be consistent across in-person, hybrid, and remote. Now, I think that's really hard because a student learning remotely versus somebody who's attending school in person full-time every day, those are just really different experiences. But they're instructed to try to come up with a grading system that's consistent. Here again, districts should consider exemptions from the grading policy for students under extreme circumstances. So there is a safety valve there. If there's some really good reason or extenuating circumstance why a student should not be graded, districts should consider that. So that's what I wanted to cover in terms of just basic information about remote, in-person, and hybrid learning. Now let's talk specifically about special education and students with IEPs. First and foremost, most importantly, as has been true from the beginning of the pandemic, school districts must provide a free appropriate public education to students with disabilities, or FAPE, as we like to call it. What's different this fall is that students should be receiving all of the services documented in their IEPs, whether that be through in-person instruction, remote, or a combination of both. That wasn't true in the spring. There wasn't a rigid requirement of implementing every single thing in that service grid. But this year, students should be getting everything. Teachers or IEP liaisons should really be in close contact with the student's parent to figure out how that IEP will be implemented, particularly if any portion of the student's school day or week is spent in remote learning. How is the IEP going to be implemented remotely? That's got to be discussed with parents. Now, this final point on this slide is a really important one, and one that I see not being implemented quite frequently, which is that using parent input, the school must provide parents with written documentation containing specific information about when, where, and how IEP services will be delivered. And the state even has a model document called a COVID-19 Special Education Learning Plan that schools can use as a model, or they can develop their own, but it's got to tell parents when, where, and how the IEP services are going to be implemented. Again, particularly if any period of the student's learning is remote. Now, in many of my cases, even families have not received this remote learning plan, and that's a violation of what DESE has instructed. When I say DESE, I mean the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. What students with disabilities will receive in-person instruction. And this gets back to what I said before, even within the category of students on IEPs, there are some who we particularly want to prioritize for in-person instruction. And Who are those? Well, first of all, it's preschool age students, as I mentioned before, but also students with significant and complex needs. Well, who are those? There's a couple of, or several different categories. So first, it's students identified as high needs in their IEP. Well, now, where would you look to see if a student was high needs? Well, it's on a form that comes in the IEP called the PL3. Now, sometimes schools don't always send out this form, but if you don't have it, you can ask for a copy of it. And it's a form where they check off certain boxes based on the service delivery that a student is receiving. And if they're spending a high amount, a high percentage of their day outside of the general education classroom, whether that be in a substantially separate class or an out-of-district school, certainly, then they would be designated as high-need students, and they would fall in this category of being prioritized for in-person. In addition, it's those students who can't engage in remote learning due to their disabilities. It's students who use primarily aided and augmentative communication devices so that they can communicate. They communicate through technology. It's students who are homeless, or those who are in foster or congregate care, and students dually identified as both having a disability and being an English learner. These students should be prioritized for in-person in any scenario where the district or school is still going to be utilizing a hybrid model. So what happens if a student with an IEP is not designated for in-person instruction, but the parent thinks that remote learning is not working or is not appropriate? Well, this has been a situation that's occurring in many of my cases. So even if the student, for whatever reason, cannot be receiving full-time in-person instruction in the school building, schools are still encouraged to provide as many in-person services as possible, even on a part-time basis. So I have one client right now who is in a hybrid model, and he's going into school 2 days a week for full-time in-person instruction. On the other 2 days, he goes into the building for an hour to an hour and a half, not to be in the classroom, but rather to receive his reading instruction. He gets daily rules-based reading instruction with the reading specialist, his speech therapy, and his specialized instruction in math from the special educator. So even though he can't be full-time in that classroom with everybody else, he could still go into the building for a little bit of time to get his related services. In addition, schools can provide these services in home or community-based settings. I haven't seen that happening a lot, but they're encouraged to consider doing so if it's just not possible for the student to come into the school building. And finally, schools must make their best efforts to take all necessary steps to ensure that students with disabilities receive as many services as possible in person. Now, with the new guidance about the color-coded information, and that more districts are supposed to be trying to invite everybody back into the building, not just students with disabilities, this is even more true. But it was even true before that new guidance, that for students with disabilities, we really want to maximize their in-person learning as much as possible. What are the recommendations for in-person learning when students with disabilities are able to go back into the building? So first, when considering staffing, students with disabilities must receive their specialized instruction from qualified professionals. So remember how I said before, the librarian can become the regular ed second grade teacher. In my case, that's fine, but she couldn't have become a special ed teacher. Students that are supposed to get specialized instruction or related services from specially qualified professionals must receive that. We can't substitute somebody else for somebody who's supposed to be a credentialed provider. There still must be opportunities for inclusive learning, very important, and students should remain learning in the least restrictive environment possible. Schools should carefully consider everyone's unique needs and should partner with parents to support smooth transitions, especially as these learning models keep switching in some towns because of fluctuating public health data. There's lots of transitions going on, and we know that so many of our kids with IEPs, this is one of their big struggles. So whether it's using social stories, video tours, maybe they're going to be learning in a new classroom or a new part of the school building. Maybe their bus route is going to change when they start going back, and we need to preview that for them so that they don't get dysregulated under the new routines. We should be prioritizing this. What are the recommendations for remote learning for students with disabilities? Well, one really important thing to note here is that there should be a shift that should have already happened from a resources and support model, which is those packets we all became familiar with in the spring, or lots of independent learning time. We should be using an instruction and services model for students with disabilities this school year. And that's regular and consistent schedule of classes, interventions, services, and therapies. No more ad hoc. It changes every week. Like there should be a weekly schedule. You know when you're going to get your speech. You know when you're going to get your reading. You know when you're going to get your OT. It should be regular and consistent. I already talked about structured learning time, frequent interactions with teachers and others, and really important opportunities for interacting with classmates. In addition, when remote learning is happening, schools must support the infrastructure necessary for students with disabilities to log in and access that instruction. Now, that can include the Chromebooks, you know, the devices. Many of us are already familiar with that, and we're in the spring. But in addition, it can also be internet connectivity. It could be Wi-Fi hotspots. Districts should be trying to provide that for families if they don't have adequate access to Wi-Fi or broadband. Also, educator and parent training. And the department even lists in its guidance some particular types of training that might be offered to parents. How to use these devices and electronic learning platforms, troubleshooting technology issues, expectations for structured learning time, and how to support students' SEL needs. Just a few examples. And these trainings, as well as all information and documents, should be provided in parents' primary language if that's not English. What are the requirements for communicating with parents? Well, schools should ensure that appropriate staff communicate regularly with parents. And the department recommends that schools document their efforts to communicate with families. At the end, in the resources section, I'm going to share a resource that we attorneys have developed, a letter that parents can use to send into the school and indicate what are the best ways to communicate with me and my family, whether it be language, whether it be times of day. How can you communicate best with me? And I'll show you that letter before we finish and make it available for anybody who'd like a copy. All communication should be in the primary language of the home. And importantly, IEP team members must consider information from parents regarding their children's experiences during COVID when they're making decisions about that child and that child's IEP. Now, one of my attorney colleagues likes to call this the shoe is on the other foot point. So normally when we sit at IEP meetings, it's the school that's with the child all day. They really have a lot of data and a lot of information about how the child's doing. Well, at least for those on remote learning, that's not true anymore. It's the parent who's sitting there with the student at home every day and who has the most up-to-date information on how that child is progressing with accessing learning. IEP teams must consider that parent's information. What is the guidance about all of the procedures, the meetings, the timelines, and other procedural requirements? First and foremost, all of these timelines that we're familiar with in special ed remain in effect. Now, schools and districts are encouraged to find pragmatic agreements around extending those timelines if it makes sense. But if there's no agreement on extending the timelines that are in the law obtain. Now, I mentioned these special ed remote learning plans that every child is supposed to get. These are not changes to the IEP, and parents' consent is not required for them. The stay put IEP does not change because there is a remote learning plan in effect. The remote learning plan is just saying how the stay put IEP is going to be adapted to a remote or hybrid situation. It does not change the IEP. It does not change the student's IEP, stay put rights in any way. So that's very important to know. Districts are in the process of addressing the backlog of all the evaluations that weren't done in the spring and so far this year. So they're kind of doing double duty. They've got to keep meeting all the evaluation timelines going forward, even while they're cleaning up all the ones that didn't happen last spring. Annual reviews must still happen on schedule, again, unless the parent agrees to an extension. And with respect to evaluations, educators are expected to use their professional judgment about whether in-person evaluations can happen and whether that's safe. I know Nathan is doing some in-person evaluations, including in a case that we're working on together, and many other evaluators, both within and outside of school districts, are doing that now. But if it's not appropriate for any reason, professional judgment should be used about what information and data can be obtained remotely, and what existing information the school already has to make good decisions about the child's needs. And then if we can't get all the information we need now, we make the best decisions we can with the information we have and get additional data when something in person is possible. Some other important provisions about special ed. So schools should use disciplinary action as a last resort when students with disabilities are exhibiting behavioral challenges associated with all of these new routines and all this uncertainty. The wearing of the masks, the social distancing, it's going to be hard for a lot of our students, and they should not be punished if they have disability-related behaviors that arise in this context. In addition, schools may not counsel students with behavioral challenges into remote learning programs if in-person is available and their parent wants them to access in-person. That's not okay. And finally, schools, districts, and collaborative programs and all special ed programs must continue to issue progress reports, those IEP progress reports, just as they would during the regular school year. Kindergarten screening for those who are entering school are still required as part of the child find process. And for those students at the other end of the age spectrum, our transition age youth, gosh, their IEPs have just been disrupted about as much as anybody's because so many things are closed down in the community, but districts are encouraged to collaborate as closely as possible with community agencies so that we can get as many transition services for those youth as we can. Okay, I want to share a little bit of information now about English learners with disabilities. So these dually identified students that you've heard me mention. So first, they are entitled to receive both their English language education services and their special ed services as part of their FAPE during this time. Districts and schools must adapt both the English language education and IEP services to account for the in-person, hybrid, or remote learning to ensure that these students receive appropriate and effective not only English language development, but also content instruction in the academic subjects that they're attending classes in. Progress through data review needs to be continuously monitored to ensure these students make appropriate progress toward their benchmarks and goals. English learners with disabilities, as you've already heard me say, should be prioritized for in-person learning during this time. Disability evaluations cannot be delayed because of language concerns, because we need to make sure that a student is evaluated in their primary language. That cannot be a source of delaying their evaluations. And as always, and this is a quote here from the federal law, assessments must be provided and administered in the child's native language or other mode of communication that's going to tell us how the student is performing. The language or mode of communication most likely to be accurate. And decision-making should include collaboration among the special ed providers and the English language educators in IEP teams and elsewhere. A lot of this information always applies. It's not unique to COVID, but I think it's important to emphasize it because for English language learners, they're really one of the groups that is most adversely impacted by this period in schools. And so I think it's important to go over some of the basic things that always apply, but that we need to pay even more attention to now. And one of these is interpretation. Interpreters must be fluent in the primary language of the home and in English and be familiar with special ed terminology. It's not okay to just bring in the school secretary who might happen to speak Spanish if she doesn't know special ed jargon and can't really help the parent understand what's going on in the IEP meeting. Schools and districts should consider technology such as language lines and other forms of technology to facilitate communication with parents if English is not their first language. All special ed notifications, as well as schedules, learning plans, IEPs, and progress reports must be translated. And schools should provide ongoing support to limited English proficient parents in their primary language, just to know everything that's going on during this time, including about health and safety precautions. What about the masks? What about the social distancing? All of that basic information that every parent needs should be communicated in parents' native language. Finally, there are some towns that are able to access a language interpreter service that the state has put together. And so the towns that are able to access this new project are listed here on this slide. So if this relates to you, you should know that there are some additional resources that may be available in these communities. Okay, compensatory education. These are the makeup services, as I mentioned before, that students may be entitled to if they have IEPs and they've missed services along the way. So for each student with an IEP, their team must make an individualized determination about whether they're entitled to compensatory ed. Districts are required, as they are with all aspects of the IEP, to consider parents' input here. Parents are the ones who really know best if their child has regressed during remote learning either because they haven't received a service in their IEP, or maybe because it was offered but they couldn't access it for any number of reasons. So parents' input must be considered. The department recommends prioritizing these compensatory education IEP meetings for students in certain categories. It's those with the complex and significant needs, as we've already gone over. Preschool age children, already mentioned those, but an additional group. And that's those students who are aging out or about to age out. Those who are about to turn 22 during this period should have these meetings really, really soon. And all of the determinations for these prioritized groups should be completed by December 15th. So they've got about a month to go. Just looked at my date here, we're on November 17th. So you've got about a month left to get these IEP meetings happening to discuss compensatory ed for all of these students. Well, what are the types of services and support a student may need to make up for lost learning? Well, there's three categories. The first is what the state is calling general education recovery support. And these are just the general education services that really should be made available to every student in the school because, even though we know there may be some groups who are particularly impacted by remote learning, there's nobody whose learning hasn't suffered. And so all schools are encouraged to make some supports available to everybody. And if they do, certainly students with disabilities should also have access to that general ed support. Secondly, COVID-19 compensatory services, or CCS, as if we needed another acronym in special ed to remember, but we got one. And these are services that the IEP team determines are necessary, either because a student has failed to make progress or has regressed, or their service has been interrupted or delayed or inaccessible for some reason. And third, in a really important category, there may be new services that are necessary because new disability-related needs may have come into being as a result of the pandemic and remote learning. Maybe the student has an anxiety disorder that they didn't have before, and so they're going to need more counseling or accommodations. New services could be added to that student's IEP, not just to make up for what they didn't get, but new services even for going forward. When the teams convene to make these individualized determinations, there are 5 questions that the team should go over. So parents should be prepared to answer these 5 questions when they go in for one of these meetings. I say go in, we don't go in anymore. We do it over Zoom, but when we log on, how about that? So first, are there services in the student's IEP that were not offered or that the student couldn't access? And what were they and how much was missed? Secondly, to what extent has the student regressed? Third, has the student failed to make effective progress toward any of their IEP goals? So maybe they didn't go backwards, but they just didn't make effective progress. And that could also give rise to compensatory ed. Fourth, does the school or district have any of these general education recovery services or supports, and are they going to make them available to the student? And finally, given all of the above, what compensatory services may be necessary to address the student's needs? So that's compensatory ed. Now we're at our final section where I just want to share some specific resources and actions that families can take, or that those helping families can take if any of the above is not going well for a particular student. So we have a sort of a top 10 list of action items that we recommend. And some or all of these may be appropriate for you, or maybe none of them are, but they're our best advice as attorneys. So first, just really to communicate proactively and often about what the student needs. You heard me say over and over again that the guidance says schools and IEP teams have to listen to parents and what they're seeing. And so take advantage of that and communicate proactively. Ask for the written documentation, number 2, of this remote learning plan. And on the final slide, and by the way, I should have said going into this that I will make the slides available. I will send them to Nathan so that he can distribute them to you. And any of these places where you see a link, these links will all be clickable so you can get to the resources I'm going over right now. And there'll be a link on the last slide to many different resources that the department has put out. And one of those links will be to this model remote learning plan. So if you have a student who's not gotten this plan, you can show the model to the school and say, hey, look, even the department has put out an example of what you're supposed to be doing. Could you please do this for my student? Mass Advocates for Children has developed, and this is number 3, a remote education log, an online log that anybody can use. It's free. We've developed it with Mass Families Organizing for Change, an organization which some of you may know. And so it's a place where you can keep track of your child's remote learning. Number 4, just know that you can request a virtual IEP meeting. And if anything's not working, request a meeting. Talk about it. Let's communicate. Let's figure out how we can make it work better. 5th, communicate barriers to engagement right away and repeatedly, which sort of brings me to number 6. And I'm going to click this link and actually show you this parent communication letter that you heard me mention before. And I'll just say the reason we developed this is because, and when I say we, I mean attorneys, because so many of our clients, frankly, are not in good communication with the school. And the school is trying to perhaps communicate with them, but not in a way that works for their unique situation. And so rather than waiting for the school to reach out and repair the communication, we thought, well, gosh, could we come up with a tool that could proactively help parents let the school know what works best for them? That's what this letter is. Let me just show it to you. I think it's pretty cool. Hopefully it'll come up. It's a writable PDF. And I will send this PDF. We have it in English and in Spanish, along with the slides to Nathan, and he can distribute them to you. So this is a letter that you could come right in here and type. You could say, Dear Principal Smith. Identify yourself, who your child is. If English is not the primary language, you can say so right here and type in the language that should be used in communicating with you. Here you can designate, what are the best ways to be in touch with me? Here's my email address, which you can copy down if you like and be in touch with me, Harvard.edu. You could put in your cell phone number. Some families use WhatsApp or Telegram. Down here, you can come down and say, these are the times of day that it is convenient for me to be in communication with the school, and times of day that you really shouldn't be in touch with me. I'm working, I'm an essential worker, or I'm working from home and I can't be spoken with during this time. It may be that some parents have had good communication with a particular person in the school in the past. And gosh, if you could have Miss So-and-so be the one to call me or reach out to me, I would sure appreciate it because she and I get along really well. Here's a place where parents can designate things that have worked really well in the past as they've communicated with the school. And on the next page, a place to list things that haven't worked so well before. And then everything sort of above applies just generally, but then this section is specifically for families with students who have an IEP. Maybe there's a language in which all the IEP information needs to be translated, including evaluations, et cetera. Convenient and not convenient times to have the IEP meeting or the 504 meeting. How you appreciate participating in the meetings. What do you prefer? And finally, maybe there's someone on the IEP team, just like maybe a regular ed teacher, but somebody who you've had good communication with and with whom you'd like to speak going forward. And then the letter says, I would appreciate it if you could place this letter in my student's file and share it with all of the adults at school who teach or work with my student so that everybody knows how to communicate well. We think that if communication can go well, that's gonna certainly not eliminate every problem, but it will make it easier to solve the problems that exist if people can be in good communication with each other. So a tool that we hope will be effective and that you can share widely with anybody who you think might benefit from it. I realize that we're at 8:01, so we're just about at the end here. I think the final thing that I'll say in terms of an action step is this one, number 9. For any of these guidelines or regulations, or certainly special education laws that aren't being implemented, parents should know that they can file a complaint with the state using the problem resolution system. And there's a link right here in the slides for doing so. I'm just going to conclude by just showing you some things. Here's a link to resources that Mass Advocates for Children makes available, some resources specific to the issue of trauma, which is my expertise, and ways in which this time can be very traumatic for some students and families. And finally, these are all those links to the DESE resources. All the guidances from which I took information today are linked right here on this slide. And so you'll be able to go to the horse's mouth, as it were, and read the guidance yourself if you would like. And that's all.
Thank you so much, Mike, for all of that wonderful information. Very timely and up to date, and that was a lot to integrate. So thank you for doing that.
A lot to listen to as well, so I appreciate
no, it
patience.
was wonderful. And thanks so much for everyone that joined in. I know we didn't have the chat up this time around. We were trying to keep all our Zoom as secure as possible, and so that was one of the things we lost this time around. But we'll try to make sure we have better opportunities for that in the future. And you can certainly email us at info.ma@dyslexiaida.org with any questions that you might have, and I can certainly pass those along. And I'll also send out a follow-up email to you, all of us who have registered, that will give a link to a recording of today's speaking presentation, and then also any additional resources that Mike wants to pass along. But all of us at IDA Massachusetts hope that everyone's hanging in there. And thank you so much, Mike, for your time today. Thank you also to any of you that are in the schools right now doing in-person instruction. That really is a frontline job. So thank you for doing that. And thank you to all of our parents that are also on the front lines. All right. Thanks so much. Everyone have a wonderful evening. And thanks so much, Mike.